3,500 square miles of rugged wilderness, scenic landscapes, and terrifying occurrences that folks might call you crazy for bringing up. Yellowstone is a fascinating place, but you'd be remiss to say it isn't dangerous. Not only due to its vast wilds you might easily get lost in, but also due to the things out there that are just waiting for you to get lost. Enjoy these allegedly true and scary stories from Yellowstone National Park, and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. Also, follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes if you prefer to listen audio only. Leave us a review on iTunes too to support the show for free. Now, let's begin. Yellowstone Backcountry from A Kilo Northwind. I was a young 18-year-old backcountry guide in Yellowstone back in the late 1970s. As you might imagine, it was a rich front of fun and adventure. For example, there was a frosty September morning when I unzipped my tent to find a 3,000-pound bison grazing less than 10 feet away. Another morning, I played a nerve-wracking game of Ring Around the Rosie with a young bull moose, dodging around willow clumps until I guess he got bored of the prospect of stomping me to death. I still fear moose more than any other wild animal. Another time in Beckler Canyon, I'd eaten my fill of thimbleberries and lounged back in the thick bushes to relax. I was startled awake sometime later to the snuffling and rustling of some massive woodland creature. I lay hidden in the bushes in frozen silence until well after the sounds disappeared. A huge pile of berry-filled scat I found nearby confirmed my close encounter with a grizzly bear. Over the several years I worked in the park, I saw and experienced so many wonderful animals. Megafauna like wolves, bighorn sheep, elk, mule deer, and black bears, to the smaller creatures like marten, coyotes, skunks, porcupines, badgers, and my personal favorite, the pika. Some of these are dangerous. All of them are delightful. There really is nothing cuter than a bouncing baby buffalo. Google it, and you're welcome. This story is about an animal encounter, but not with any of the animals mentioned before. Every week of the short Wyoming summer, I would guide a group of 8 to 10 people on backpacking excursions through various trails of Yellowstone. Usually our outings were 5 or 6 days, and we covered anywhere from 45 to 70 miles in that time. In the wilderness of Yellowstone, this meant that at our midpoint, we might be as much as 35 miles and 3 river crossings from the nearest road or ranger station. Many of the clients were city folk or backpacking novices, so it was quite an ambitious adventure for them. Consequently, they always required a little hand-holding and quite a lot of instruction and encouragement. There were a handful of other guides in our organization, and it was standard practice for us to work in teams. I and my clients would start at one end of a trail while another guide and his group would start at the other. We would pass at some point in the middle, have a long group lunch, and share trail notes. It was always a welcome opportunity to connect with another guide friend. On this particular week, my group had started right at Old Faithful Geyser. Our destination was the Beckler Ranger Station, 60 miles away on the southeast boundary of the park. Of course, this meant that the other group would be doing just the opposite, starting at Beckler Station and ending their hike at Old Faithful. In between, both groups would see dozens of astonishingly beautiful waterfalls, cross the Continental Divide a couple of times, enjoy world-class fishing, see some incredible and rarely seen thermal features, and of course, see plenty of animals. If the weather wasn't terrible and no one got lost or eaten, this trail was always a winner, one of my absolute favorites. My group was a cohesive group of fathers and sons who already knew each other. They were great people, but definitely out of their element. They were city dwellers, and they were bargain travelers. None of that is particularly an issue for me. Just an observation. I was worried that a couple of boys were wearing vinyl shoes. You know the kind I'm talking about if you grew up in the 70s. Kmart specials, made out of some ballistic PVC. They aren't great for hiking, but they do make great blisters. Oh well, I'd rather have someone wear the shoes they're used to than wear a stiff new pair of boots. When we gathered round for a pack shakedown, it was less than ideal. One of the dads had about 15 pounds of camera gear, huge SLR 35mm and all the extras. Beyond that, there was lots of cotton clothing, some really crappy rain gear, some sketchy aluminum-framed packs, and way too many extras of everything. So basically, the usual. In the 70s, backpacking was different. In a way, it was simpler and purer. Not many people had ultra-light gear back then. Internal frame packs were a rarity. Compact liquid gas stoves were a novelty. In fact, it was almost more common to see army surplus than much specialized backpacking gear. I really wasn't concerned with the group. These guys seemed physically fit and they all had positive attitudes. The weather looked good, and we had pared their pack weight down to respectable levels. It would be a great week. After Old Faithful erupted right on time, we hit the trail. Within minutes, we were surrounded by pines and the traffic noises faded away. The hikers were chattering and horseplaying, but I knew a few miles in the sun would settle everyone down. We stopped at Lone Star Geyser and were lucky to catch another eruption. Not a great one, but a real treat considering that about 99.9% of park visitors will never even know this geyser exists. I prompted everyone to remember to drink. Then we hit the trail again. Our first camp wasn't really very far down the trail, so we arrived early and had plenty of time to cook a good meal, sort out our sleeping gear, and get to know each other. Everyone slept well, and morale was not a problem. The next morning, we climbed the Continental Divide and covered a lot of miles. There were the typical blisters, a few grouchy moments, and our first moose sighting. We lunched at Shoshone Geyser Basin, and I was gratified at the group's collective amazement at the place. A few of us swam in Shoshone Lake. Then we hiked on to camp number 2. The third day, we hiked downhill into the head of Beckler Canyon. The next 2 days would be a highlight. Shady trails, scads of massive waterfalls, and wild berries and great fishing. After setting up our camp that evening, we hiked a mile back up the canyon to one of the few spots in Yellowstone where it's legal, or even advisable, to soak in natural thermal springs. The boys hurried ahead and apparently surprised a skinny-dipping couple. As the poor woman scrambled to put on her swimsuit, the boys gallantly turned their backs, but not before getting an eyeful. Later in the week, I overheard one of the boys telling another in whispered awe of how beautiful the young lady was. Ah, puberty. Day 4 was the midpoint. On this day, we would meet the other group of hikers, headed the other way. If we timed it right, like we usually did, maybe we could meet by one of the major falls for a scenic lunch. Oddly, we passed both Iris and Colonnade Falls, with no sight of the other party. I began to dread that they might have met with some emergency and been delayed. In the backcountry, emergencies are amplified by distance and communications, especially in the 70s when, of course, there were no cell phones. On a previous trip, a client had a simple asthma attack, which would have been almost inconsequential in normal conditions. But at high altitude, with limited medication, the man had nearly died of hypoxia. So I was already on edge when we finally caught our first glimpse of the other group. It was already late in the day and they were still miles from their next scheduled camp. It only got weirder after that. As the group came near, I noticed the guide, my friend Mike, was hiking out in front. This is unusual, as the guide usually rides drag, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Clients love to be in front. And instead of the group being spread out a bit on the trail, which naturally occurs, the entire group could have been contained inside the length of a school bus. It looked so wrong. As they got closer, it was obvious that everyone in the party was quiet and subdued. In fact, they looked positively grim. I ran a quick inventory of what the heck might be going on. Had they had some sort of argument or fight? Had the crew mutinied on the guide? Had their group lost someone? Had someone been injured? In any case, the guide, Mike, and his whole group were somehow stressed or mad or something. Consequently, I held back in approaching my friend. So rather than stepping forward to meet him, like I would ordinarily do, I held back. I would let Mike come to me when he felt like it. In any case, I called pack break for my crew, and they all shrugged off their packs, starting to rummage for lunch and organizing water refills. They were a great crew, and now they were practically running themselves. By now, Mike's crew had hiked past most of my guys, and he was drawing even with me, as I was sitting on a downed tree about 2 meters off the trail. Mike and his group were all still in that bizarre tight formation, so much closer together than people naturally hike. It was confusing the heck out of me. It was about that point when I began to think that Mike was going to hike right past me, without even acknowledging me. What in the world was going on? My curiosity and alarm got the better of me, so I spoke up. I kept it short, because I could see he was really stressed about something. I just said something simple like, "Hey Mike, everything okay?" Without skipping a beat, he turned and said quizzically, "Do I know you?" I was stunned and confused by his weird response. I was about to stammer back some reply when he said, "Oh, right. We met on this trail last year." Then he flashed a weird, fake smile, waved and turned quickly around, and kept walking. It happened so fast that he was 20 yards up the path by the time I gathered my wits. Obviously, he didn't want to talk to me, but why? I watched him to see if he gave any other clue. Nothing. I then scanned his small party to see what that could tell me. Nothing. At first. As they hiked around the bend and began to disappear into the trees, I noticed that one of the hikers had only a small day pack. What? And another hiker had no pack at all. I had almost missed it, as they were hiking so closely together. I was stumped. I was dumbfounded. Why didn't those guys have gear? Why wouldn't Mike acknowledge me? I thought for a moment to run after them, but what would I do? I didn't even know what was going on. It all seemed almost unreal as I watched my guys casually passing around food and filling canteens. They were subdued and quiet as well. I had told them we would have lunch together with Mike's crew when we found them. We had delayed lunch by nearly 2 hours. They wondered what was going on too. Eventually, one of the dads asked me if he could help. I told him about the weird exchange between me and Mike and then about the 2 hikers with no gear. As we talked about it, I guess a few theories started to crystallize. It struck me like a slap that Mike was somehow under duress. I felt a hollow sense of brief panic and almost took off running after him. But what would I do? I still didn't really know anything. If Mike truly was in trouble, the last thing I wanted to do was make it worse. As I and the other adult continued to desperately puzzle over the situation, we heard the thubbing of a helicopter in the distance. The copter flew overhead at fairly high altitude. I doubted it could even see us. I wondered if it was constrained by the high walls of the canyon or if it was just trying to be careful. By now, I felt fairly sure that it had something to do with Mike's crew. I didn't know if we should try to signal the helicopter or if that would just cause confusion. In any case, I knew the helicopter would be unable to touch down anywhere around us, as the canyon is dense with old-growth trees and steep rocky walls for miles. In a moment, the helicopter was past us, and it was all a moot issue. Still at a loss for what to do, and kind of out of a dumb sense of duty and normalcy, I just ended up calling the end of pack break, and we got back on the trail. In 2 miles, we were out of the canyon and on the edge of Beckler Meadows. a massive flat grassland that stretches for miles. We found our campsite and set up camp. Sick with worry and still miles away from Beckler Ranger Station, I was doing a lot of anxious mental hand-wringing. I was torn between hiking out overnight to get help at the ranger station or hiking back up the canyon to help Mike myself. I was reticent to leave my crew in any case. I was honestly scared and confused. Before I could belabor the issue much longer, we saw two riders on horseback on the far edge of the meadow. They were covering ground fast. In a matter of minutes, they were at our camp. When I saw them up close, I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more worried. They were two park rangers, armed, and both had rifles in their saddle scabbards. Before I could say anything, the rangers simply told us to pack up and head south. When I asked why, they told me they had fugitives in the area, and we were to abort our trip plans. Naturally, everything cleared up for me in an instant. I quickly told the rangers what had occurred with Mike's party when we had passed them in the canyon. I told them about the two men with no gear. I was able to give the rangers details about what the men were wearing, and I let them know what Mike looked like too. I was even able to tell them that Mike's group was scheduled for campsite 9D1 that night, 3 Rivers Junction. At that point, the ranger canceled our evacuation order. With the solid information about where the fugitives were, and with positive IDs, the ranger felt we were no longer in immediate danger. Straight away, the rangers rode on into the canyon. It was a nervous evening and a long night. When morning came, we broke camp and started the hike across the long, grassy meadows. I was hopeful that Mike was already safe, but I had no way of knowing. I made the decision to cancel the last leg of our hike in order to get to Beckler Ranger Station one day earlier. I wanted an update as soon as possible. It would mean we would forego seeing Union Falls, which is arguably the highlight of the trip. But there was no way I could have waited any longer to find out if Mike was safe. We got to the ranger station a bit past noon. I had dragged my poor clients past some of the best fishing in the world. We had blown past Cave Falls and Dunanda Falls, but graciously the clients were cool about it. By now they were all in the picture, and they were very understanding. The minute we got to Beckler Station, we were fortunate to find a talkative ranger, and we got all the details. The two rangers who had ridden past us the day before had already radioed in with the resolution. Mike? He was safe. All of his crew were safe. The fugitives were in custody and had been taken out to the road at Shoshone Lake. The duty ranger was good enough to tell us how it had gone down. The fugitives were 2 young adults from the Idaho Juvenile Correction Academy over in St. Anthony, Idaho. In Idaho, individuals up to 21 may be retained in the juvenile system. These men had assaulted staff and escaped with a stolen vehicle. They had traveled the 30-mile-long dirt road between Idaho and Flag Ranch on the park's south boundary. They ditched their car after dragging the oil pan out and hiked into the park. They had overtaken Mike's group at their campsite in Beckler Meadows. Obviously, when they passed us, they were holding the group by threat. One fugitive had a large knife, which he had brandished, and the other claimed to have one too. They controlled the group by positioning one man right behind Mike and the other at the end of the column. They kept the group very tight together. With the information I provided, the 2 rangers had actually beaten Mike's group to their next camp. They had taken their horses on the far side of the river on the equestrian trail and had been hidden and waiting by the time Mike and his crew arrived to set up camp. Prudently, the rangers had waited until the party had bedded down for the night before moving in for a quick and easy arrest. One of the fugitives had been standing guard, while the other was curled up in a ground tarp, which they had taken from Mike. After the arrest, Mike was a pro. He and his crew finished the week-long hike. What else could they do? They were 25 miles from anything. He said it was probably the best thing for everybody, because they all had a couple of days of solitude to process the traumatic situation together. He said by the end they were joking about it, and it seemed like an integral part of their great adventure. By the time they got to Old Faithful, they were all friends for life. Mike did tell me that when the helicopter had flown over that day, the guy with the day pack had freaked out and ordered everyone to get under cover of the tree canopy. Mike said the man held him by the back of his belt with the knife resting against one of his kidneys until the helicopter had gone. As for me, I thanked Mike for his quick thinking and acting like we were strangers. I apologized for almost blowing his cover. Obviously, his sharp wits and selflessness prevented my whole group from getting tangled up with fugitives too. Who knows what the men might have done if they found out we were together. My group ended up having a good week too. We left the trail a day early, but they had certainly got their money's worth. If you're ever in Yellowstone, keep an eye peeled for dangerous animals, including the two-legged ones. Scary Yellowstone Experience from Marc F. This happened around 2 summers ago while I was camping and hiking in Yellowstone National Park. Prior to this incident, I did not believe in strange creatures or monsters. Oh, how that changed after this experience. To add some background, I'm a 25-year-old male who loves the beauty of Mother Nature. I find peace while spending time in God's creation, and I sometimes go alone just to clear my head. I'm an avid fisher, hiker, camper, and backpacker who has seen pretty much everything from bears to tarantulas in the wild. What I saw in the Yellowstone National Park was like no other creature I've ever seen in my entire life. I was camping deep south of the park by myself, and I was having the time of my life. The skies were clear with blue, and the sun was beaming down. I was just getting back from fishing when I heard a cry about 50 to 100 yards away. It was coming from my left in a wooded area. The noise sounded like a painful, elongated yelp, with the sound dying out slowly at the end. The cry sounded female, which was strange because I was very isolated from others, and I hadn't seen anyone the entire trip. I wasn't really scared at first, but I was definitely cautious of the sound. Instead of calling out the cliché, "Hello?" I decided to stay silent, as it's best not to attract whoever that was to my location. They could be dangerous or crazy, for all I knew. Plus, I did have my handgun and Remington shotgun, so I was ready if anyone tried to harm me in any way. Now, I'm a pretty laid-back guy, but when stuff gets serious, I'm always alert and prepared. I decided to get my fish into the cooler and go on with preparing my meal for the night as sundown was quickly approaching. I understand that some listening are wondering why I didn't hightail it out of there after hearing that noise. To be fair, it wasn't a big deal to me at the time. I honestly chalked it up to being an animal, and I understood that I was deep in nature. I mean, weird sounds happen all the time in the woods. However, if it was a person making the noise, why would I let them ruin this experience for me? I drove 6 hours and hiked for 3 to get to this spot, and I'm not packing it up just because some loser is trying to ruin my fun. If they wanted trouble, they would get trouble. I'm a fair, honest, and kind man, but you don't want to meet me in the dark. The sun went down and no other noises persisted around my campsite at all. I ate my meal and stargazed for around half an hour, thinking about my dad. He just passed away from brain cancer, and I was still grieving the loss of him. He had been on my mind a lot, and his death was the entire reason I came out to the forest. I wanted to clear my head. I wanted to find peace in his death, knowing that he didn't have to struggle anymore. At this point, it was pitch black, and I was so exhausted I went in my tent to crash after a long day. I hit the hay around 11:30. I had this awful nightmare where I was sitting in an unfamiliar room with my father. He was just staring at me with an angry look on his face. I asked him if he was okay and why he looked so mad at me. but he never responded to any of my questions. Instead, every time I spoke, he would interrupt me by opening his mouth and a loud metallic banging sound came out. It wasn't a noise a human could make at all. Every time I spoke, the noise got louder and louder, and I started to panic in the dream. And for some reason, I could not move. This metallic noise was so loud, it was driving me crazy. Finally, my father ran at me with the noise at peak decibel levels, and I woke up in a cold sweat. I was absolutely relieved that it was only a dream, but I wondered the meaning of it. My thought process was cut short when I heard that same metallic noise outside my tent. I couldn't believe my ears. Could I still be dreaming? The noise happened again and I realized I was more awake than ever. Someone was out there messing with my stuff, and that made me mad. I grabbed my shotgun and I burst from my tent as fast as I could to find nothing. Absolutely nothing. I turned on my flashlight on the shotgun. I beamed it around everywhere, but to my surprise, I didn't see anyone. I looked over the ground and found my thermos beaten in and bent. That must have been where the metallic noise was coming from, but who in God's name would be doing this to me all the way out here? I looked at my watch and the time was around 2 in the morning. I shouted for the person to come out and confront me for the damage to my property, but I was met with silence. I mean utter silence. No grasshoppers, no birds, no owls. I was terrified at this point, despite the massive shotgun I had with me. Could there be multiple people doing this? Could this be an animal? Is this a prank? I finally heard a loud thump around 15 feet behind me. I turned quickly, and I saw it. This creature, this thing, was not human at all. The moment I saw it, I even questioned my own faith. It was a tall, white, pale, humanoid figure that stood on 2 legs. It looked like a human, but it was all wrong. It was between 7 and 8 feet tall, with black sunken pits for eyes. Its eyes had no emotion, no pupils, but I felt it staring into my soul. It was deathly skinny, as I could see its bones, and its arms were so thin they could be snapped in two. It had large black claws that were almost talon-like. It opened its mouth, showing distorted black pointy teeth that looked razor-sharp, and it spoke in a hoarse, scratchy voice. "Why are you here?" I was so terrified. I'd had enough. I began to fire at the creature with my shotgun. It bellowed in a loud screech that sounded like an elk and a screaming woman combined. It lunged at me with incredible speed and landed a hard blow on my head. I hit the ground hard, and the last thing I saw before I blacked out was the creature going crazy, destroying my campsite. When I came to, it was light out, and everything had been destroyed, as well as everything inside it. My shotgun and handgun were torn apart. They were now useless. I don't want to know how this creature was capable of that. It must have massive strength. I stopped and wondered why I was even alive. Why didn't the creature shred me to pieces? Did my gun scare it off after it hit me? Did my shotgun even do any damage? I realized that I needed to leave at that moment. Nothing was salvageable, so I just grabbed my truck keys and I started my 3-hour hike back to my truck. The entire way back, I was just processing what happened the night prior, and everything I believed in was gone. I was certainly concussed. That creature had given me a strong blow to the head. I can't believe something like that exists in the world, and it chills me to the bone to know it's still out there. I got home and told this story to nobody. What am I supposed to say? I might sound absolutely nuts if I do. Who will believe me? All I have to say to the listeners on here is to not hike or camp alone. I am very lucky to be alive. To this day, I've stopped my old hobbies, as now I'm horrified to go back in the woods. Ghost Girl at Yellowstone, from Jackson 5522. First off, I want to say this was the scariest moment of my life. We go on a family vacation every year. This year we were going to go to Disneyland, but that was canceled due to the Rona. So we decided to go to Yellowstone instead, because there's less people and guidelines of social distancing. On the day of departure, we left around 6 at night, as my dad doesn't get off work until 5. In the car and on our way to Yellowstone, I fell asleep. I was super tired the next day. Suddenly, I woke up at one point because of a loud bang. I looked out the window and I saw this woman in a white dress. She was staring back at me. She had these crooked and yellow teeth. She mumbled something like, "Hi, what's your name?" I screamed. My mom told me to knock it off. It's only my imagination. I told my mom to look. She's right there. But when she looked and I looked back, the woman had vanished. We didn't see anything. We made it to Yellowstone early in the morning. I went to use the restroom while Mom and Dad were unpacking the car. As I proceeded to do my business, there was suddenly a knock at the bathroom door. I answered it. "Yes? Who is it?" No one responded. Then it happened again. Once more I tried to answer it, but there was no response. Not until I heard the voice of a girl giggling outside the bathroom door. I ran out of there as fast as I could. Thankfully, nothing else weird happened that day. Monster at Yellowstone National Park, from MariahCW, and read by guest narrator Carman Carrion.
I never thought my mom's chain-smoking habit could land us in so much trouble. She entered us both into a contest to win a 3-day stay at the Marlboro Ranch in Montana. I ended up being the one winning despite being a non-smoker. There were 50 winners, and each could bring one guest, so there were 100 people in total that went on the trip. It was my first time flying and will probably be my only time. I had to take my anxiety medication to even feel somewhat normal. We landed at the Bozeman Airport, and from there we were shuttled to the ranch. The little town we stayed in resembled a saloon setting, complete with Western decor. We stayed in the room Aspen, which was actually nicer than the other rooms. It had a living room for some reason and was larger than the other rooms. I'm honestly not sure why we got the nice one. When we arrived, all of the gear that we would need for the activities they had laid out was sitting on our beds. There was stuff for mountain biking, horseback riding, and I think even rock climbing. This was shaping up to be an incredible experience. I didn't know how fast that thought would be extinguished. The very first day was the best, at least at first. The weather was absolutely perfect. Crystal clear blue sky, sunlight beaming, a gentle breeze stirring up leaves. It was serene. The tour guides took us through Yellowstone. We got to watch Old Faithful erupt. You could see the steam coming off of the geyser. There was a section where we could overlook the waterfall. I will guiltily admit that I wasn't retaining much of the history and descriptions of the attractions, as I was too absorbed in the beauty of the scenery. Our group that had around 30 people in it ended up splitting up to hike some of the trails around Yellowstone. My mom, myself, and maybe 5 to 6 others broke off with one of our tour guides. We hiked, and not too far into the tree line, the smell hit us. I'd imagine if you took a dead mouse, a pack of meat you left in the fridge for a year, a decomposing body, and mixed them all up in a blender, you'd get the smell that was assaulting us. It was hard to fight back a gag. My mom is much more sensitive than I am. She threw up. Thankfully, everybody else held their stomachs. We asked the tour guide about the smell, and she hesitantly told us that very rarely animals will perish close to the trails, and it was possible that's what we were smelling. We ended up finding what we thought was the source of the smell. A white-tailed deer lay maybe 10 feet off the trail, its insides completely torn out and its limbs twisted at odd angles. It had a look of pure terror locked onto its poor face. My mom threw up again. The tour guide hurried us past it and started telling us about predators in Yellowstone: black bears, grizzly bears, coyotes, wolves, and a couple of others, any of which could have been responsible for killing that deer. The tour guide took us quickly through the remainder of our hike, and my mom and I were shuttled back to our room. We didn't dwell too much on the deer incident. It was just one of the park's predators that killed it, right? Nothing to be worried about. The second day, we went horseback riding. We ended up wearing the wrong jackets on accident and were freezing the whole time. The weather was overcast, drizzly, and downright miserable. We were both nursing hangovers from the previous night. It was an all-expenses paid trip, including alcohol. The only things you had to buy yourself were Tylenol and batteries. They even cut us checks for $1,150 to cover the taxes that we would have to pay on the trip. Drinking the previous night had been a mistake. Bouncing on the horse in the cold with a pounding headache, it was a recipe for a bad time. The trail we took was only wide enough for 2 horses to be side by side at a time. There were roughly 10 of us, with somebody guiding us at the lead. My mom and I were in the very back, unable to hear the person in the lead and relying only on following the crowd. We were about 15 minutes deep when my mom said, "Mariah." I looked at her. "Yes?" I inquired. My mom looked over at me. "What?" she asked. "You said my name," I replied. "What did you want?" "I didn't say your name," she said, rolling her eyes at me. She was in a pissy mood, so I didn't push her. Somebody had said my name, and I didn't reckon it was the person at the lead that I couldn't hear. Who said it? Was my mom just messing with me? I heard it again after not even 2 minutes. I looked over at my mom for the second time. Did you say my name?" I asked her, a slight tremble in my voice this time. "I think you need your ears checked, or your brain checked, because I have not said a word this whole time," my mom replied. I heard my name called probably 5 more times. Each time I looked at my mom dumbfounded, but she never even glanced my way. She had to be messing with me. There was no other explanation. After we finished horseback riding, we went back to our rooms and put on our appropriate jacket for hiking. Rather than spend another night drinking, we wanted to go back to Yellowstone and hike some of the trails by ourselves while we continued to shake off our hangovers. We were both able to ride a shuttle back into Yellowstone and take one of the trails up into the mountains. We actually talked, made plans for the evening, and discussed what we'd like to do the next day. When we heard twigs breaking and footsteps on the path, we didn't think much of it at first. Just other people on the trails, right? There were at least 100 people to account for, on top of the regular tourism. There could be anybody taking the same trail as us. When I heard my name called again, I stopped. My gut was telling me that something wasn't right. This time, I didn't hear my mom. I heard my fiance's voice, who was back home in Kentucky. When I stopped, so did the footsteps behind us. Somebody was following us. Through the haze, I turned around, but saw nothing. My mom pestered me, telling me I was just being paranoid and there was nothing to worry about. We continued, but as we did, so did the footsteps. This time they were faster. Then that smell from that first day hit. My mom doubled over, vomiting. I looked behind us again. I could see something through the mist. A moose, I thought at first, because it was so massive. But it was all wrong. The legs were bent inward, and it was deathly thin. So thin I could see actual bones through this thing. I swear I could see flesh slough right off of its body. Its piercing yellow eyes bore a hole right through my chest. This rotten creature cantered towards us, its strange gait sending an icy ball of fear sinking into my gut. I always thought that when people say they froze out of fear, they were willfully staying that way or were exaggerating. Not true. When I say froze, I was glued to my spot. I couldn't move if I wanted to. My mom rose back up and turned around, breaking me from my state. I could see a scream building on her face. "What?" she started, but I clamped a hand over her mouth. We stared at the creature and it stared back. I almost soiled myself, I was so scared. Voices erupted from in front of us, behind the creature, jolting us out of the stare down. I think the noise frightened it, because it ran away, disappearing into the trees. My mom and I ran, right past the tourists, right to the shuttle, and right up into our room. It was a cold, sleepless night. No amount of heat could scrape the fear out of our bones. At some point in the night, I awoke. I wasn't sure what had awoken me at first, but then I heard it. A scraping sound against the window. I looked to see a long, crooked claw raking itself down the window. A horrible screeching sound emitting from it. I glanced over at my mom, who was fast asleep. I pulled the covers over my head, tendrils of fear licking their way through my limbs, leaving me in its gut-wrenching grip. I couldn't fall back asleep. I laid and listened to the scraping sound for hours, until eventually the sun began to rise and the sound dissipated. When my mom awoke, I went to the window looking out. We were on the second floor, a good 15 feet off of the ground. Whatever was scraping the window had really been tall or could fly. My mom didn't talk much the third and final day. We went and got a full-body massage and tried to drink the memories away. The flight back was even worse than the flight there. I was just thankful to be headed home, away from Yellowstone, and away from the freakish rotten moose. I thought that I had left all my worries behind me. That was until I awoke in the middle of the night in the perceived safety of my own bed. The scraping sound was back. A wave of fear and nausea rolled over me as I tried to write it off as a branch, or something natural hitting my window. I glanced up, only to find myself staring into the bright yellow eye. I could almost make out a smirk on its disgusting, rotting face. "You're mine," it murmured, in a deep, gravelly, distorted voice that sounded worse than the nails on a chalkboard. My ears rang, and once again, fear took over and ate away at my stomach. The creature continued raking its claws against my window like a cat playing with a mouse before it kills it. Panic bubbled in my throat. I got up, grabbing my blanket and pillow and taking it to the couch. The following morning I said nothing, but the dark circles under my mom's eyes tell me she had her own demons pursuing her last night.